Okay, so let me admit more people. Sorry, because when I read the introduction, I cannot really accept more people. So I want to make sure that I get everything in the waiting room. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the 28th talk from the Petrolern at Home seminar series. I'm Hamed Saroush, the CEO of Petrolern, and I'm very pleased to introduce our today's expert speaker, Dr. Femke Vossepoel. It was right?
That was correct, Hamed. Yeah.
I'm not going to translate it, so.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. We are very pleased at Petrolern for being able to serve our community with 27 fascinating talks by top professors and industry leaders during the last 4 months. We try to select talks to cover all subsurface spaces, including oil and gas, geothermal energy, and carbon storage. However, our program is coming to its end, and we will have our last P.A.S.S talk next Tuesday, 28th of July, which is basically my presentation titled Wellbore Stability, What are the Common Industry Mistakes? It's kind of the abstract of my 25 years of experience working in geomechanics in oil and gas and geothermal, and discuss 7 deadly mistakes that commonly people do in the industry when developing safe mud weight window for drilling. Overall, I hope that the program has been of benefit to you guys. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all the experts, speakers who shared their knowledge and time with us, from universities, from industry, from state, organizations, entities, and also all who attended our talks during the last 4 months and supported our program. Despite the termination of the P.A.S.S program, we will continue to provide technical talks on an ad hoc basis whenever we face interesting topic that we feel, you guys might benefit from it. So I hope that all of us pass through this difficult time safely and in good health. Please make sure that you follow us on LinkedIn for updates about our company. So before introducing Dr. Femke, I would like to ask everyone to mute the microphones, turn off cameras. If for any reason you couldn't stay with us until the end, we are recording and sharing the talks on our website at www.petrolern.com. If you have any question, please use the chat box to write your question. Femke will kindly answer as many questions as possible. So today's talk is a little bit different from all the talks that we had before. While it's still technical, but it addresses one of the biggest challenges that human being is facing right now, which is the COVID-19, and how geoscientists can contribute to it using their technical knowledge. So I'm really looking forward to listen to this presentation. Dr. Vossepoel is associate professor in geoscience and engineering at Delft University of Technology in Netherlands. In her research, she assimilates data into numerical models of subsurface flow and mechanics to estimate the effect of subsurface activities and associated risks. With a PhD degree in aerospace engineering, very different from what she's going to talk about today, from Delft University of Technology, she spent a year as a full bridge fellow at the University of Maryland in the US and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration in Washington, D.C. This was followed by 2 years at University of, let me translate this French, Pierre and Marie Curie in Paris, and 5 years at the Institute of Marine and Atmospheric Research, Utrecht, of Utrecht University in Netherlands. In 2007, these 12 years in academia were followed by almost 10 years in industry with Shell. In this period, she applied her expertise in the field of data assimilation to applications of assisted history matching for closed-loop reservoir management. She also led opportunity evaluation in unconventional resources and portfolio analysis in Shell's business planning. In September 2016, Femke was awarded a Delft Technology Fellowship, which enabled her to return to Delft University to take up her current position and build her research portfolio in data assimilation. Applications of her current research include, but are not limited to, the use of gravimetry and satellite observations for surface movements related to subsurface processes such as water production, geothermal energy, hydrocarbon production, gas injection and storage, and resource mining. Triggered by current events, she embarked on a project to investigate the use of data assimilation to improve the assessment of the COVID-19 pandemic. With that said, Femke is all yours, and I'm looking forward to hear your presentation. Thank you very much for doing this for us.
Thank you very much, Hamed. I think this was a very complete and complete introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity that Petrolern is giving me to talk about this recent project. It's great to see people from all around the world, and I realized for some people it's Friday afternoon, so they may be looking forward to their Friday night drink more than to a technical presentation, but I'll try to keep it light and entertaining.
No, we are not allowed to drink in the US, by the way.
Well, you can drink a soda, right? Yeah, so in this talk, I will indeed describe how we use techniques that are developed originally for the geosciences, how they can be used to assess the current COVID outbreak. But I want to make a disclaimer here. I'm not an epidemiologist and I don't have a medical background. So I'm also not going to make any statements about the future developments in the corona virus development. But it's really meant to give you an overview of the technique of data assimilation and to show you how it's able to deal with uncertain data, like the data we currently have on the COVID outbreak. Let me see, it's a bit slow perhaps in flipping the, yeah, there it goes. The agenda is as follows. I will start with an introduction and tell you about what is really data assimilation. I'll give you some applications as we know them in reservoir engineering. My windows. I'll describe current approaches in data assimilation, and then I'll get to really the core of my presentation, which are the recent results that I obtained in a very international group looking at the evolution of COVID-19. As Hamed already said, some of my students joined today, and I really want to acknowledge them and show a bit of their ongoing work, so you can also see where current developments in data assimilation are going, and I'll end up with a conclusion. But first, yeah, data assimilation, and I'm showing you here the sequential type of data assimilation comes from weather forecasting, from oceanography and meteorology, where we combine numerical models that predict the weather with observations from that system. And of course, the observations are not always extremely accurate, so they have an error. And we also realize that our model is just an approximation, so it also has an error. And taking into account both the errors or uncertainties in our model and in our observations, here indicated with the green circle and the blue star, we try to find the optimal solution or the most likely solution given the measurement and the model and given their uncertainty. And every time an observation comes in, we take that observation, we incorporate it in our analysis, and then we run the model forward to come with a prediction for our next assimilation time step. At that time step, we obtain a new observation, we compare it with the model, and we optimize our solution. And going forward like this, we can actually estimate the perfect trajectory of our system. And we hope that once we don't have any observations left, from there on, our prediction or our forecast of the system will be the best possible forecast. Now, this has been used extensively since the 1960s in weather forecasting. And as of 10, 20 years, it's also being used a lot in reservoir engineering. And in reservoir engineering, the application is very strong in something called closed loop reservoir management. This is where our current dean in Delft, Jan-Dirk Jansen, has developed a framework which he dubbed closed loop reservoir management, where the data assimilation is used to do assisted history matching of reservoir models. This means that you run an ensemble, a set of models, reservoir models, dynamic models, where you include data from different sources. So geological maps, seismic data, well logs, well tests, fluid properties, but also what you obtain from sensors like rates and bottom hole pressures and sometimes time-lapse seismic. So all these data go into the models with this data assimilation algorithm. And by doing that, you obtain the best possible reservoir model, which you can then use to predict your production forecast. And with that production forecast, you can optimize your production strategy. So in this manner, it's being used operationally in a number of large oil and gas firms. And this is also very much a field very much in development. And it's interesting to see how new data types are being incorporated in this data assimilation loop. And that's really where my expertise lies. So there are colleagues of mine who are much more into the field of optimization. But what I'll be talking about today is really this data assimilation loop. Now, what are the ingredients of a data assimilation system? Well, first of all, we start with this numerical model, which is, in the case of reservoir engineering, our flow model. And we start with something that's typically stochastic. So there are stochastic terms in this model. This is more the case, by the way, in oceanography and meteorology than in oil and gas engineering, because there very often the models are quite deterministic. But let's, for the moment, assume there is a stochastic component, and then your state evolution, so the evolution of pressure and rates, temperature, other variables in your model will look like this, with a deterministic term and a stochastic forcing. Now, we also have observations, and in the case of reservoir engineering, these are rate observations and pressure observations from the wells, and I denote those with the letter Y. The superscript N here is meant to indicate the time, and as you can see, we predict the state based on what we know from the previous time plus a certain forcing. Then the relation between the two is what we indicate with this operator H, where we map the state variable to our observation. And very often this is not more than a mere interpolation of this state variable. But we should realize that when we collect this observation, there's noise in our observation, there's measurement noise, and that's indicated with this epsilon. Now, if we formulate this in a Bayesian sense, then this is how it looks like in a more graphical representation. As you may know, in Bayes, we would have the probability of something happening given something else. Let's say the probability of x given y can be written as the probability of y given x times the probability of x, and then we normalize this product. Now that's in maths, but in a more graphical representation, you can think of the observation having a certain value and a certain and a given uncertainty, typically obtained from your measurements, your instrument manufacturer. And then we know that our model has certain uncertainties, and in some very nonlinear models, you could actually have two very different outcomes, which are both quite likely, but the model can go one way or the other way depending on the forcing or the parameters. So if we know that there is a probability for a model to exist, if we know that there is a certain value for the observation to exist, we can combine those two probability density functions in this posterior probability using this Bayes theorem. And this then provides a distribution of the probability of model realizations given the observations. I wasn't aware that I had noise in this animation. Moving on to how that then looks like in our data assimilation system, we distinguish two different types of data assimilation. The first one, which is more common in oceanography and meteorology, is the state estimation, where the purpose of data assimilation is really to estimate the temperature, the velocity, humidity, you name it. And then we see that in this Bayesian formulation that I presented before, the target is to estimate the probability of the state given the observations. And you will recognize this equation from my data assimilation ingredients in the beginning. And mind you, if we write it like that, we compute this state as a forward problem. So technically speaking, it's not necessarily an inversion, although a lot of people refer to this estimation as an inversion. Now, likewise, we can also estimate a certain parameter. So if we talk about reservoir engineering, we're typically after the right permeability distribution given a set of observations, or in a geomechanical problem, we're after the Young's modulus or the Poisson ratio given the observations. In the COVID example that I will illustrate in a moment, you will see that we're after the reproduction number, and after other parameters that we assume to be constant in the evolution. I need to say here that, because I was just mentioning the reproduction number, that's actually a time varying parameter, whereas in most cases we assume a parameter to be constant in time and a state variable to be varying in time. Now, let me start first by showing you a number of applications in reservoir engineering that have been published and developed over the last 10 years. What I'm showing you here is from the work of Justina Prebic-Jarnout, who defended her thesis, I think 10 years ago. And I like her work because it very clearly illustrates what data simulation can do in a quite a simplistic case. In her work, she compared the use of time-lapse seismic data and production data, rate data in this case, and looked at what could be the added value of assimilating seismic data into a reservoir model. And the reservoir model was extremely simple. It was a 2D model with 5 wells, injector in the center, and 4 producers in the corners. And we assumed it was a synthetic experiment, so we assumed that we would know the true permeability field, which is shown here. And I think this is in a log scale. I'm sorry that the print is so small. Now, when we started data assimilation, we realized that we don't know this permeability field very right. So we start with a prior that is not very articulate. And then we assimilate data. We assume that the seismic time-lapse data that we have give us a field, a description of the density field, so we can actually see where the water is pushing away the oil, and we have an oil production rate. Now, when we assimilate those data and we try to run an experiment with just seismic data, with just production data, and with both production and seismic data, we could see that the combination of both production data and seismic really gives better results than when you would have production data only. And then Justina played with the noise of the data, and you can actually see how this affects the solution, but it's clear that once you have this density information, your posterior description of the permeability field shown here, I think you can see my mouse, is better than your prior, and it's better when you add seismic than when you just use your production data. And of course, with these type of synthetic experiments, there are all kind of fun things that you can do. And we've also used that to test different data types, such as gravimetric data. I'm now showing you the work of Martin Glegola, who defended his thesis, I think 7 years ago. And he worked on a field that's dubbed the Bruges field. It's a synthetic reservoir model constructed by TNO here in the Netherlands, which has been used for an international benchmark study. And it's open source, everyone can use it. So you can play around with this model. And Marcin created a permeability field and a porosity field, and he generated synthetic data for that. You see here a set of different realizations, and then showing the bottom hole pressure. And for the same realizations, this is plotting the gravity signal. In blue is the prior distribution, and then after doing the assimilation, assimilating what you see here in the black line and here in the black line, we obtain a posterior estimate, which is the red line. And as you can see, the posterior is much closer to the observation than the prior, so the data influence or have a positive effect on the distribution. Now, what was interesting in this work is that in most operational assisted history systems, we update typically permeability and porosity. But in this case, Marcin also adjusted the top and bottom horizons of your reservoir. So he changed the geometry of the reservoir, and he also changed the forcing of the aquifer. And now you will understand that if you have multiple parameters and state variables to adjust, you would like to do more of a sequential or an iterative procedure, and that's what he developed. The paper is a SPE paper and can be found under this number. Now, I just showed these two examples to make clear to you that data simulation deals with both uncertainties in the model and the data, and that the misfit between those two comes from many different model errors, and that the data are never accurate, but that the problem in real life is that we don't know the truth. So I've just shown you two examples of synthetic cases, but then the proof of the pudding is always in testing this in real cases. Now, before I go into the more real case of the COVID prediction, I'd like to give you a bird's eye view on different data assimilation approaches that exist. And it's also giving you a little bit of an historic background in data assimilation. I think I don't need to explain this graph again, but the essence of data simulation is really about maximizing the likelihood of finding the most likely solution, and preferably actually the distribution of the likely solutions. And that is often done in more geostatistical techniques by minimizing the variance. Now I can demonstrate, I will not do that here, that for linear systems, the two are equivalent. But for a nonlinear system, and if the noise is not Gaussian, then the two are different, and that actually resulted in the development of a number of different data simulation schemes. And then our ultimate goal is really to find a model estimate that agrees with the data and takes into account the uncertainties both in the data and in the model. The approaches that we see in the geosciences are when we talk about the assisted history matching, what I showed you the examples of before. The Ensemble Kalman filter is still very popular, but this is being replaced more and more by the Ensemble Smoother multiple data simulation, which is also the method that we used for the COVID study. And then another popular method, which I will not discuss today, is the randomized maximum likelihood. In other geoscience fields, and I'm then talking about meteorology, oceanography, but also hydrology, the use of 4D VAR is more popular. Ensemble Kalman filter is being used in both fields, and the particle filter is especially interesting for highly nonlinear system, and we're currently investigating this for seismology. But let me start by 4D VAR. That is historically the most used data simulation system for weather prediction, and the best solution is here really the variance minimizing solution, where the variance minimization is being expressed as a cost function that has two terms, and one term represents the error in your initial conditions and the other term represents the error in your observations. So by minimizing this cost function, you try to minimize the error in your initial condition given the data. And this means that we evolve the estimate from previous estimates, and every time observations come in, we try to find the trajectory that we update the initial conditions. We try to find a trajectory that fits those observations, but at the same time respects the error in our initial conditions. So every time we move to a point where data are available, we need to go back to the beginning, update this, and then run until we have the next observation. And this is how we continue to go on. And by doing so, we obtain a very smooth trajectory that typically gives a very good forecast. Well, this is how it was traditionally being used in most weather forecasting centers, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, as well as in NOAA. And the error was really assumed to be very much in the initial conditions. Now, this approach is very nice because it delivers a physically consistent solution, but it requires an adjoint, which means that every time you update your model, you also need to update your adjoint, and it's quite a computationally expensive method. So with this as the starting point, around the 90s, the mid-90s, a number of people started to develop sequential data assimilation. And one of the key persons there is Gareth Evanson, who developed the Ensemble Kalman filter. And this brings me to the picture that I showed you before, which I've explained before, where it's no longer a smooth trajectory, but you're now updating your trajectory every time observations come in. And the most used method for that is the Ensemble Kalman filter. There are different flavors. There's the extended Kalman filter, there's the Ensemble Transform Kalman filter, and I won't go into all those details, but all of them share that they're based on the original Kalman filter, which was designed for space orbit determination. And they basically start from a model estimate that is based on the model estimate one time step before, and it then uses you will recognize the ingredients, the observation minus the model equivalent of the observation times a product of a number of matrices, which is referred to as the Kalman gain. And the most important matrix in this set of matrices is this PF, which represents the variance of your forward model. So without going too much into detail, also because of time, the key point to remember here is that it's a sequential model that uses a given state at one point in time and then propagates this forward, multiplying the difference between observation and model equivalent with something called the Kalman gain. And this P of F which is this most important matrix that represents the errors in the forecast, is constructed, and that's the key point of the Ensemble Kalman filter, with an ensemble of model realizations. Now, let me show you why we would like to work with an ensemble of realization. If we start from a given situation and we would have just one single trajectory moving to the next time, we could make assumptions about the uncertainty in that estimate at the initial condition, and then simply assume that the uncertainty would have the same shape at t is t plus 1. But in reality, and especially for nonlinear systems, these trajectories evolve, and all of them evolve differently, which could mean that your distribution at time is t plus 1 is actually quite different from your distribution at time is t. And this also means that your error covariances will look differently. And it's exactly this propagation in time that we use when creating the that PF, that error covariance matrix, from our ensemble of model simulations. Now, this also avoids the inversion of large matrices, which is needed in a lot of other non-sequential methods. And we can map the full probability density function, which is really nice to have. And that brings me then to the ensemble smoother multiple data simulation, which can be seen as a derivation of the Ensemble Kalman filter, where again we minimize a cost function consisting of two terms, and you may recognize the terms that I also showed in the 4D VAR, except that this time we have, and I apologize for using different letters here, we have one term here that relates to the model error, and one term here that relates to the data error. It was called R in my previous equations, but we see that we here have a tempering coefficient alpha, and we have an iteration number n, which means that we're going recursively through our system. And the reason we do this is that the ensemble smoother multiple data simulation is typically used in systems where we do parameter estimation. And as I said before, parameters are assumed to remain constant over time. So whenever we do the simulation, we actually have to go back to time step 0 to change our parameter and then rerun our evolution in order to make sure that we capture the full evolution with the right parameter. Now, in practice, this ensemble smoother means that we start with an initial ensemble. We choose our ensemble members from a given distribution. We generate a prior ensemble prediction, and this gives us the model equivalent of our observations. And then very much like the Ensemble Kalman filter, we produce an update based on the previous time step times a certain gain multiplied by the difference between observations and data. And then we rerun the entire model from the beginning for an updated prediction of this y. And we do so in a number of steps, indicated here with the capital N -1, and that gives us the final solution. Now, before I move on to the practical use of this method, I also like to quickly show you the idea of particle filters, which again is based on the Bayesian principles, which you've seen a couple of times now, so it doesn't require any further explanation, I think, but you really use to shape this probability of the model. We use a set of model realizations, and we can then propagate the full distribution of this ensemble. And that means that we can then compute this posterior probability by multiplying these ensemble members with a weight, where the weight is then actually the remaining terms here in your equation, written like this. And that's actually quite an intuitive procedure, which basically tells you that you can, if you don't know how the best solution looks like, well, let's just run 1,000 or 10,000 different models and then simply see which one fits the best to the data. And then, of course, we take into account the uncertainty in the data, and that sits here in this Py of x. And in a graphical representation, and Peter-Jan van Leeuwen has a very nice paper on that, it looks like this. If you consider the time axis horizontally, and this is time 0, time 10, time 20, then we run a number of simulations forward, and as soon as data come in, we determine the weights for each of those particles, and those with that are closer to the observations obtain a higher weight, and we then propagate forward, and you'll see that sometimes the same members get a high weight, but sometimes members that had a low weight first get a higher weight in another time step. Now you can already see the problem with this method is that it's degenerate when you have a moderate ensemble size. And for that reason, there are all kind of different flavors of the particle filter that I'm studying in my group in order to avoid this degeneracy. But enough about the maths now. With this introductions of different methods, I'd like to move to the system or the study that we did for COVID-19. The initiative for this study was taken by Gary Evanson, who was also the founder of the Ensemble Kalman filter. And it was a great pleasure working with all of these colleagues in 9 different countries across 8 different countries, 9 different institutes across the world. And the paper has been submitted to Foundations of Data Science, but a preprint is available at this website. Now, the countries included there are shown here, and I mapped them on top of World Health Organization map of COVID-19 cases or deaths. This map is showing, and you can see that most of them are in countries where there are considerable number of deaths. I think if you look at the number of deaths per population, perhaps the map might look a little bit different. This is for Quebec. There should be a star which has disappeared in the US as well. Brazil, Argentina, France, the Netherlands, England, and Norway. Now, the model that we use here is different from a reservoir model. It's different from an ocean or a meteorological model, but in essence, it's just a set of differential equations. So, you know, even as geoscientists, we can deal with it. And these colored boxes are different compartments, and they indicate, in this case, for different age categories, and I think that was special about our model. They indicate those susceptible to a disease, those exposed to the disease, those infected by the disease, and then those who are sick or quarantined, you hope, with mild conditions, with severe conditions, and with fatal conditions. And of course, for the more severe conditions and the fatal conditions, people were hospitalized, but we realized that there are also a large number of people with fatal conditions who never went to the hospital but stayed in care homes or even at home. And this is something we took into account in our study. Now, for the ones with the light symptoms, they recovered. That's where the R stands for. And unfortunately, for the fatally ill, they died. So this model, and you can see in the small print the time periods that rule the dynamics between those compartments. They give you a number of parameters which are all uncertain and which we try to estimate with our data simulation. Of course, we have initial guesses for those parameters, and some of them we can get actually from the medical websites, and some of them are very well studied in medical papers. So whenever we had parameters that are more about the disease itself, we kept them relatively fixed, and we allowed a very small standard deviation. But some of the numbers were really badly known. How many people have been exposed in the initial conditions? How many people have been infected? And what was the real reproduction number? If you look into estimates on those, they're highly uncertain. So those are the parameters and state variables that we estimated. We also estimated the case fatality rate for different ages, the hospitalization rate, and the fraction of the fatally ill actually going to a hospital. And we made sure these were age dependent. Now, the observations that we used were of varying quality. Shown here is are the data on the left-hand side for England and on the right-hand side for France. And you can see, for example, here with these data from one of the health institutes in England, that they really vary as a weekly cycle, which is showing that in the weekend there tend to be less people reported deaths than during the week. And you can actually see that between the different institutes there was quite a deviations. So that gives us an indication of what uncertainty ranges to apply to our data. In France, there was a similar story, but it was interesting that in France, the number of deaths in care homes was also being tracked quite accurately. So that's very good information. Now, the approach that we took in our data simulation, we chose a prior value for this reproduction number. And I think you've all seen similar graphs like this, where the reproduction number really tells us how many persons one person can possibly infect. So if R is 1, every person is infecting one single person. If R is 2, then it's infecting 2, etc. And we made guesses for the age distribution and the region, and then we assimilated the deaths and the number of hospitalized, and sometimes we only played with the intensive care people. And in some studies, we assimilated the number of infected, but these numbers were typically very uncertain, so they were hard to use, into an ensemble of model realizations. And just to make sure that our ensemble was large enough, and since the model could run very quickly, we used an ensemble of 5,000 members, and we used the ensemble smoother multiple data simulation method. Now, I would like to start with our case study in the US, also realizing we have quite a number of attendees today from the US, and my American coworkers picked these four states, mostly because they have very different evolutions of the pandemic. As you all probably aware, in New York, the outbreak was most severe, and there was a very strong lockdown. And this is nicely expressed in a study by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation by using cell phone data, where there was a very strong drop in mobility, 66% reduction, and also in California, a large reduction in mobility has been measured, 55%, and then in Alabama, the orange line here, no, the blue line, it was only 38%, and in North Carolina, where my colleague scientists reside, it was 47%. So you have 4 different behaviors in mobility, and also 4 different behaviors in the evolution of the reproduction number. Now, what we all did for each case study for each region or country or state is we started with a constant reproduction number. Ideally, we put it around 1. And then we said, well, the reproduction number is really not very certain. So we're going to assume a very large standard deviation in our prior assumption. And then we basically had the data tell us how the reproduction number would look like. And I'm showing you here the results. The prior is indicated in blue, the posterior in green. And this is time roughly from the 1st of March until late July. And data were only assimilated until late May. And you can see that and this axis is different than the other axes. In New York, there was the largest peak, but what was striking is that in some of the other states, we had a number of oscillations after that first peak, and this might have been related also to the demonstrations of people not wanting to follow the government's measurements, and also people have different ways of living. They have different ways of transportation. In New York, a lot of people were using public transportation, but then really responded very quickly and efficiently to the lockdown, whereas in other countries people are driving by car, which also affects their mobility. But they, depending on the severity also of the disease in their states, they may have responded differently, and that's shown here in this evaluation of the RT. Now, we also did an experiment where we assumed that at the moment that the government the CDC was giving their guidance on March 16th, all states responded with changing their behaviors and having a drop in the reproduction number. And if we assume that with quite a strict, low standard deviation in the R, then we see somewhat similar oscillations in the countries where we saw them before, but we see that the R can really stay around 1 for each of the states. And again, we see the sharpest drop for New York. There was some discussion about what is happening here in North Carolina. There's a hypothesis that perhaps people from New York moved to their second home in North Carolina. I'm not sure how speculative that is, but the key point that we learned from these experiments is that you can see which states responded more strongly to the government guidance than others. And this is showing you how the data really pulled the prior forecast to a different level. In most states, the number of deaths indicated here with the dark green lines is higher than our prior estimates, except for New York, where the data actually are showing that it was lower, and hence our forecast is also lower than what would otherwise be predicted. And I think this is demonstrating the response of the New York state to the guidance. Now moving on quickly, I see I'm taking longer than I hoped I would, to the predictability, because that's a question that we often get. And my colleague Peter Houtekamer of Quebec studied the predictability of our system, and he concluded that for a period of 2 weeks, the system predicts reasonably well. He found that for Quebec, the predictions tended to underestimate the cumulative total number of deaths in the beginning and to overestimate this at the end. There are different reasons why this could be the case. One of them is that possibly the reporting wasn't very accurate, especially the number of cases is very uncertain. Another hypothesis is that the system may be responding to, or the patients may be responding to the treatments better than what the model is able to predict. Remember, our model is a bit of a simplified model, and a lot of processes are not captured in this model. But all in all, the predictability is reasonable for a period of 2 weeks. Now, I don't want to end this talk without showing you some results for my own country, for the Netherlands. And there we compared assimilating just intensive care beds with the number of hospitalized. And we observed it especially in the beginning. And mind you, this is a logarithmic scale. We are able to capture the data much better if we assimilate intensive care beds than when we assimilate the hospitalized. But in the end, the forecast is very similar. What I thought was really interesting is we did the same trick as I showed you before for the American states with a constant R, and you see that the response to the measures in the Netherlands seemed to be quite good and actually dropped down. I must say that at the very moment this week, the R number is increasing again, so I've already put everything in place to run new forecasts. But one thing we tried is, since the Dutch RIVM, the Dutch Health Institute, has been communicating their estimates of R, we've tried to work with a gradual R, which is showing you this this response, and you can see that actually the data seem to indicate that the R was higher than what we thought it was. Now, for details, I can refer to the link that I showed you before, but just the main conclusions from this study were that data assimilation with this relatively simple compartmentalized SEIR model provides for online and automated estimation of the reproduction number. And we had to deal with very uncertain data, but it turned out that the assimilation system was quite well capable of dealing with that. And we found a significant forecast skill suggesting that we can use this system also to evaluate scenarios, so we could test different measures. But of course, the missing link there is then how do certain government guidances translate to the behavior of people. So what's next? The same group of researchers is interesting to continue this project. We would like to find funding for this. And then we would like to evaluate the forecast and hindcast for the periods between writing the manuscript and today. And we think we need to add a time dependency to some of the model parameters that are now assumed to be constant in time. One very difficult thing to include is the effect of traveling, but we would need to talk to modelers about this. And then I think it's really interesting to evaluate the effect of different measures in different countries. Now, I don't want to end this talk before ending with some of the ongoing work in Delft. I'm going to speed up here. We have applications in geothermal energy, induced seismicity, subsidence, flood risk. This is one I recently got a proposal awarded, so I'm looking for students, should you know someone. Slope stability and our COVID, and the methods that we're using in our team is particle filtering, Ensemble Kalman filtering, Ensemble smoother, multiple data simulation, and variations on those methods. Now, very quickly, I know he's in the audience. Siamak Abalassani did some outstanding work using probabilistic methods for the combination of controlled source electromagnetics and seismic. This is an idealized reservoir that he's able to map. He will have a paper at the EAGE. If you send me an email, I can send a link. Silvia Pintea is developing or has developed a machine learning algorithm that's able to classify different lithotypes, where we also compare this to the same estimation using data assimilation techniques, and we have plans to incorporate AI into our data assimilation methods. Then in the field of seismology, we have Hamed Montero looking eventually at induced seismicity in Groningen as part of a DeepNL program. And the DeepNL program also studies subsidence, where Samantha Kim is working on. Both of them presented their work at the EGU. So if you Google them for, no, actually, Hamid's going to present at the American Geophysical Union, and Samantha presented her work at the EGU, the European Geophysical Union. And so did Arundhati, who's in the audience today. She's also looking at the use of data simulation for seismicity. And these are some of her results. And to show you that we're also doing things with mining. Mohammed Moussan is looking at the stability of open pit slopes in lignite mining, and he's doing so with various measurement techniques and geomechanical models. But the takeaway messages that I'd like to send to you is that data simulation provides a mathematically robust and a very efficient way to combine data and models. It's being applied successfully in a number of different fields in geosciences, and our application in the COVID-19 pandemic led us to a number of interesting insights, and we may be able to forecast and prevent further spreading. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for attending this meeting. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at this email address, and I'm open to all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Femke. Very interesting presentation, and it's good to see that geoscience community and geoscience knowledge and modeling can help basically in this strange situation. What I really like to do is to use our modeling to predict when the vaccinate is out. Do you think you can do that with assimilation?
Yeah, well, if you have a good model that shows you how the vaccination is reducing your how you're being infected, I think that could really help you. That would basically mean we would reduce one of the parameters and then run again with that. But that would indeed be very interesting to see how that would then be affect the data simulation, and we would see probably only a reduced, very much reduced R and a reduced number of people infected.
Okay, thank you. So we have time to take a few questions. Please type your question in the chat sections if you have any questions. So I see a few questions already there. The first question is asking how are the asymptomatic, people managed in the model, infected and contagious but unknown to anyone. I don't know if they.
So
okay.
yeah. So there, and actually this, thank you very much for this question, Sahasi, if I pronounce it correctly. They're indeed uncounted, and they remain unseen in our model until these people end up in hospital. So, but we do have a factor that takes into account that part of the number of infected are so the basically the infection rate is also takes into account that part of them may not have symptoms.
Okay, so the next question is from Robert Gales, asking if the models predict the resurgence, do we need to link openness to subsequent changes?
Yeah, well, just to answer that first part, the resurgence, and then I'm not sure if he means the resurgence here in the Netherlands or in any other country, but you typically do see a response in the R, but then since the period of prediction is only 2 weeks, it's actually quite short, so you don't really know how it's then going to evolve afterwards. And I'm not sure what is meant with, do we need to link openness? You mean we should share this on our website?
Robert, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question clearly from Femke? If you see if he's still here. I don't even see him anymore in the meeting. So he left.
Oh, he may have
Okay, that's
left.
fine.
Yeah,
Don't worry
that's a
about
pity, yeah.
it. But there's one more question
Yeah,
from
and then
Zahaki. Yeah. Do you want to read through it yourself? So.
yeah, so he's surprised at how low the post-isolation RT value is. So it's around 1 or even less. Yet in many countries, the rate of infection is increasing. And then this person is making a link to the asymptomatic population, and I think that could indeed be part of the reason. The most straightforward reason is that we only simulate the data until the end of May. So whatever you saw after that was a forecast based on the data end of May, and then taking into account that the forecast is only valid for about 2 weeks. Whatever happens after that isn't really trustworthy. So if I would have shown the data after May 29th, I think you would see that research, and then the asymptotic population. I'm not sure whether that's really part of the reason. I think in general, just not having sufficient data on the infected cases is a problem for our system. So I don't know how this is in the US, but in the Netherlands we start to test more, but still it's only a small part of people being infected that are really being tested. So the data that we have on the number of infected is highly uncertain. And are we assisting governments in scenario prediction? Yeah, so this happens in Norway and in Quebec. My co-authors in those countries are in close contact with their national health institutes. In the Netherlands, I've been exchanging some emails, but they have so many people offering their help and their research tools that I'm personally not assisting our local institutes. But who knows, this may come in future, and I completely understand that they're extremely busy with their existing tools at the moment.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, and I think we are good to close the session. I really want to thank you again, Femke, for the fantastic talk. Thank you very much. And everybody else attending the meeting, just remember that next Tuesday, 28th May, is our P.A.S.S Talk goodbye party with the last talk by myself, and hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much again, all, and have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot, Hamid. It was an
Thank you.
honor to be here. And thanks a lot for all those who attended and stayed to the end.
A lot of audiences are actually say thank you to you. So
Oh,
take
that's
care.
very kind. Yeah, thanks a lot.